Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being with us today. I'm David Rubin, Managing Partner at Hinckley Allen, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our valued clients and friends, our colleagues, and our very special guest, former Boston Mayor Kim Janey. We're excited to have you here for our Social Justice Initiative Lunch and Learn event. This is the first in a series of events sponsored by Hinckley Allen's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The goal of these events is to increase our collective awareness and better educate all of us about issues of social justice and racial equity. Today's event is focused on the status of social justice and racial equity in the city of Boston and the important role of the business community in making progress toward those ends. In my view, there's no one better able to provide a valuable and insightful perspective on today's topic than former Mayor Kim Janey. Mayor Janey is a fourth-generation resident of Roxbury. She's dedicated her life to public service as an advocate, community organizer, as a Boston City Councilor, president of the Boston City Council, and most recently as the 55th mayor of the city of Boston, the city's first woman and first Black mayor. In 2021, Mayor Janey was named one of Boston's most impactful Black women and listed in Boston Magazine's 100 most influential Bostonians. Mayor Janey, thank you for being with us today. We will look forward to learning more about you and hearing about your perspective on the important topic of today's discussion. Now I want to turn over to my partner, Jay Gonzalez, who will facilitate the conversation with Mayor Janey. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I want to turn to our special guest, Mayor Kim Janey, and welcome you here to Hinckley Allen, and thank you for being here. For all the reasons that David described, you have a really unique life experience and perspective to bring to this conversation about social justice and racial equity in Boston. I know it's going to be enlightening for all of us, and so I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jay, and I want to thank you, David. I want to thank everyone who is tuning in. It is an honor and a privilege to be with you this afternoon to kick off your Lunch and Learn series. I also want to say thank you to Lee for all of her work behind the scenes. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Lee has been, I want to join the thanks for Lee. She's done an amazing job pulling this together. A couple of other thanks. My colleagues on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee for helping to develop and support this important new series we're launching, starting with Mayor Janey. I also want to thank David and the rest of firm leadership for their support for this initiative. And I want to thank all of you who are here today. I think we had close to 200 confirmed RSVPs for this event. Lots of colleagues from Hinckley Allen, clients, other friends of the firm, thank you so much for being here and for your interest in this topic. We are going to talk, the mayor and I are going to talk a little bit. I'm going to ask her some questions. We're going to have a conversation. We'll probably go until about 1. And then the last half hour is going to be reserved for questions from you. You should submit your questions over the course of our conversation. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question. All the questions are going to be printed out and handed to me for the last half hour, and I'll read. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of them, but we'll get through as many as we can and have the mayor answer questions from you. So with that, I want to get started. I had the privilege of getting to know you when we were on the campaign trail together in 2017. One of us ended up having an amazing, great, impressive victory, and one of us didn't. I think everyone can guess who's who. You won a great race for Boston City Council, your first run. You subsequently served on the council for 4 years, became president, elected president by your colleagues. And then when Marty Walsh went to Washington, you ascended to the high office of mayor of the city of Boston, which is amazing. I mean, what a cool gig. There's a lot, we were talking before about, it's a very hard job. There's a lot that comes with it, a lot of challenges, but it's also a pretty amazing life opportunity. And I was hoping you could just share with us a little bit, what was one or two of the coolest things about being the mayor of the city of Boston?
Yeah, well, being mayor certainly is one of the best jobs in the city of Boston, no question. And I know it will sound cliche, but one of the coolest things was helping people. That was the most important piece of the job. It was certainly my favorite part of the job was helping people. I remember at the beginning of the school year, being in Mattapan Square, having a back to school event, and working so hard on getting the vaccine out equitably into the arms of residents throughout the city, and how challenging that was in Mattapan, and being at this event and talking to this family, and 3 generations got vaccinated right there on the spot, Haitian family. So that was very rewarding. And then there were other like cool things of just kind of thinking about growing up here in the city of Boston and all the things that I experienced as a child growing up, as a young adult in the city, and then being mayor. So for example, Frog Pond. You know, I played there as a kid. I played there as a kid. I brought my daughter there as a young single mom. I've brought my grandchildren there. And last year, I got to cut the ribbon and open up Frog Pond, which was incredible. The Boston Marathon. I've gone to the Boston Marathon, I don't know how many times. All throughout childhood, we used to go to the finish line to cheer on runners. It was just part of our tradition because my great-grandmother lived in the South End, so we would always do that. I've always run to the marathon, and then last year I got to crown the champion. Cool is that? I mean, it was incredible.
That is pretty cool. And Frog Pond, for people who don't know, is this great little park within the Common, famous park in Boston, that has an ice skating rink, that's a splash pool for kids and playground and other stuff. So yeah, you get to do fun things like cut ribbons and the really important stuff, like you described, the family in Mattapan is great. So we were talking a little earlier about your campaign. While you were mayor, you ran for a full term against Michelle Wu and other people. And you had this great TV ad, which I loved. And it was for the benefit of everybody else.
And you can play it, Jay, if you want. We can play that ad.
The mayor was standing there in the street or somewhere, holding this big frame. And that's how the commercial starts. And then these pictures start flipping through the frame. And it's a picture of every prior mayor of the city of Boston. And it goes on and on and on. Every single one of them. Every single one a white man. And it goes on and on and on. And then it ends with a picture of you. And the question that was asked while these pictures are proceeding to flip through this frame is, what makes Kim Janey different from all of the prior mayors? Flips through the pictures, it gets to you, and you say, experience, which was really funny, but also really powerful, because it was a reminder that you were the first person to have that job that brought the unique perspective of being a Black woman to that job. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit, maybe share an experience or two about how your being the first Black woman mayor changed the way in which the mayor did the job and changed the way in which people engaged with the mayor. there's anything you can say about that.
I would love to. So one, I will start with how people engage with the mayor. On the one hand, as a woman, as a Black person, the intersection of race and gender, I experienced all of the isms that come with being a Black woman, all of the ways that the world receives you or perceives you different than my predecessors. On the other hand, I think there was, and so that's the negative. On the other hand, I think there was this huge recognition from all over the city of, wow, this is a new day for Boston, and how important this was for Boston, a city that for generations has tried to escape this perception of being a racist city. And so it was, I think, an important turning point. I certainly understood the significance of it, having grown up in the city, having thought myself that there would never be a Black mayor. But it was probably this encounter that I had with an older Black woman early on in my tenure. I was walking out of City Hall, and for some reason, I was going out of the main entrance. I wasn't going down the back cave to my vehicle. I was walking down the main steps. I had exited the building, and I ran into this older Black woman who saw me and immediately started to cry. Immediately just started to cry. And that moment has just stuck with me for the longest. And there was another moment like that at a ribbon cutting for housing. Another older Black woman, this woman was in her 80s, and she just cried in my arms because she could never in her lifetime imagine that we would get to this day. And so she just cried. She wept in my arms. And we actually cried together. So
that's amazing. So like you felt that. And I think many of us in the city felt, wow, this is a really special, as you said, turning point. But for people in the Black community in Boston, you were the representation, personification of so much progress, so much more. And you got to experience that feeling from them.
Yes, and it was very, very powerful. And then the final thing that I would say, because your question was really about how that informs the work. I bring that perspective as someone who grew up in the city, experienced many of the challenges that so many residents are facing today. And so bringing that perspective of what it means to live in subsidized housing, what it means to rely on free lunch at school, what it means to rely on public transit to get my daughter, around the city. All of those things I was bringing with me as mayor of Boston, and using that to inform the work and to make policy change that would be lasting, but also impact our residents in a much more powerful way. And making sure that we were leading with equity.
Yeah.
Leading with equity.
And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which I know you did that, and your being there did make a difference. I think one thing people may be interested in before we get into it is what you're up to now. Since leaving office, I know we were talking with Pat Rogers earlier about the fact that you took a little time off. But I know you're up to some exciting stuff now, so maybe just share some.
Yeah, it's been great. I am doing 2 fellowships. So I am at the Kennedy School at Harvard at their Institute of Politics. I am one of 6 fellows there. I am leading a study group on racial justice and recovery, leading cities to a more equitable future. Tuesdays are my study group. So last night had an amazing session. We had a guest speaker join us who has done incredible work in her field. We've had a number of speakers. We've had great sessions. It's been amazing. I have a team of students who are so incredible. 2 of them are from Boston. So I love spending time with them. I actually took my students at Harvard to Boston City Council, and I'm meeting with Mayor Wu last week, so they love that. The other fellowship I am doing is at Salem State University. I am one of 2 inaugural fellows. They've got a pretty new Institute of Politics. They started it in 2019, but COVID came.
So, justice and racial equity in Boston. Before we get to where Boston is now, I want to go back. You mentioned that one of the valuable perspectives you brought to the job of mayor was the fact that you grew up in Boston. And I was hoping you could just share a little bit about what Boston was like for you as a young Black girl growing up in Roxbury in the 60s and 70s, and whether there are any particular experiences you can share that would shed light on what it was like, the state of social justice, racial equity in Boston at that time, that really stuck with you and made you particularly aware at the time of the color of your skin.
Yeah, so, I remember not being able to go wherever I wanted to go. I remember, and specifically South Boston. So for anyone who lives in the city, is familiar with the different neighborhoods in the city, this particular neighborhood was a neighborhood that Black residents did not go to. And the same was true for residents of South Boston. They did not come into Roxbury. And I remember as a young adult, maybe not so young, it's probably the early 2000s, so probably not so young, working for a nonprofit. And one of my colleagues lived in South Boston. And he was Latino, and he lived in Southie and was doing work in Southie before we were working together at this nonprofit. And we had decided we were going to have like this retreat of staff, and that we were going to do it at someone's house, and we were going to do it in South Boston. And I just remember feeling like, I'm not going to South Boston. And by this time, I don't know how old I am. I've got to be at least in my 30s. And that carried with me from childhood, that South Boston isn't a place that you go. And that is because of what I experienced as a kid, with the racial tension, with the fights. And a lot of that stems from busing in Boston. And folks may be aware that I was bused as part of the Garrity desegregation order. So I was bused to Charlestown, which was very much like South Boston. And so rocks, racial slurs, fights, lots of racial tension. And so I remember that as a kid. I also remember a lot of blight and empty lots, and just, it was not a city like you see now, filled with cranes in the sky and lots of development and people investing in the neighborhoods. And so I see that change. But it wasn't all bad. So I want to be very clear. The other thing that I saw growing up was this activism of people in the Black community who were determined to change the conditions that they saw all around them, whether that meant running for office, like Mel King's historic run for mayor, that I volunteered on as a young girl, or the way folks fought the highway that was going to come through a number of communities of color in Boston back in the 60s and 70s. It was that activism that kind of a roadmap for me as a young adult, as I was thinking of career options and being very much guided by my desire to provide my daughter with a better education and a better life opportunity. And that's how I got into organizing and advocacy. But it was those lessons of that activism in the 70s that I witnessed firsthand from my family, from people like Mel King, that I still carry with me to this day.
I was going to ask you how, in those experiences, like being bused and rocks, and I mean, it's really hard to wrap. It's hard for me to wrap my head around. You were saying that the activism was a positive. You saw people coming together and working to improve, and that is part of what inspired you. Are there other ways in which you feel like those experiences, both the good and the bad, have influenced who you are and kind of the trajectory you took in life?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I, in some ways, feel like there was no other choice. Like that was just the path that I was on from an early point in my life, just because of my family and the community and everything that people were being denied and all the ways that we were coming together to fight that. That certainly influenced and informed career choices, policy decisions. So much in my life was informed by, growing up here in the great city of Boston. So it is, it is a great city. I know it is a city where, want to talk about our racist history and present, as well as the perception and reality of racism in Boston. A lot of people want to talk about our cold weather. A lot of people want to talk about our bad driving. A lot of people want to talk about, all of those things. But the reality is Boston is truly a great city because it is a city that continues to strive to get it right. It is a city that continues to fight for liberation. It is the birthplace of democracy and these ideals that we hold so close to our hearts. And my hope is that we will continue to aim high, to use to use your yes, I remember aim high slogan. Exactly. To really live up to those ideals. Yeah.
Well, you could see how someone coming from your background with some hard to wrap your head around negative racist experiences that you were subjected to the positive of the activism and everything else. You could see how someone coming out of that type of background could lean very pessimistic, hateful, not optimistic about the potential of this place, or the way that you clearly have and are. And I wonder if you've got a view of the Black community in Boston generally, and whether you feel like there's a general optimism right now. We're going to talk a little bit more about where we are in Boston today, but just in terms of general feeling, whether you represent the way the Black community in Boston is feeling today, or I'm sure it's more complicated.
So it is, and I want to be careful not to put all the hopes and dreams of a community on one individual. I think that is never a good idea. I think, we are a community of different experiences. And so I do feel that weight. However, you feel that weight whenever you're in elected office or whenever you're responsible for other people, you have that weight, that burden. But I tend to be hopeful. I tend to be a person, that's just part of my personality. I wouldn't do this work, certainly not in elected office, if I didn't believe in the power of being able to change, or people coming together to come up with a better idea, to put forth a policy solution that will improve the lives of people in our community. I'm hopeful that we can get there, which is why I ran for office in the first place. If I didn't think that things would ever change or that I could do something about it, then I wouldn't have done this. Now, my assessment of the optimism of the Black community in Boston may be a little different. I'm not sure everyone has the same kind of hope that I have. In fact, I see a community that is very frustrated by being denied time and time and time and time again. Just this morning, getting ready to come here, listening to NPR, yet another report. I mean, how many reports? Yet another report on Black and brown people being denied mortgages at much higher rates than white residents here in Boston and throughout the Commonwealth. And so, you know, I think the optimism that I have may not be shared widely by folks, and with good reason. I was just going to say, with very good
with a lot of good reason.
Exactly.
I want to hit on some more of the stats that would support having a good reason to not be satisfied. Your optimism and belief in the ability through government to help make progress and make a difference in addressing a lot of these issues was your motivation for doing so is great to hear. As somebody who is passionate about government and believes deeply about the really positive role government can play in people's lives, we need people like you to be in those positions who are not deterred and determined to find paths forward and bring people along and make progress. So anyway, Boston was lucky to have you doing what you were doing. I'm going to read a little bit because I know you know all these facts, but I want to make sure everybody who's listening does. Just to get a little deeper into where we are in Boston today. Now, most of this is from a 2017, so a few years ago, report of the Boston Globe that they did a 7-part series. It was an award-winning series on the state of race in Boston. And what they exposed was really disturbing in a lot of ways. And I'm just going to read a little bit here to give people a sense of some of what they exposed. They confirmed through their reporting that Boston continues to have a racist reputation. They reported on the massive wealth gap between Blacks and white people, citing the findings of the Boston Federal Reserve that the median net worth of a white family in Boston was $247,000, and the median net worth of a Black family was $8. Black professionals feel isolated in Boston. Discrimination continues to be pervasive, with 2/3 of Blacks surveyed saying they felt unfairly treated in the prior 30 days, landlords less likely to return calls from applicants with Black-sounding names, and so on. Similar to this report that you just heard on the radio today. A brand new neighborhood developed with significant public support in South Boston, the Seaport District, turning out to be one of the whitest in the city. This was a whole new neighborhood that was built last decade. That recently. Segregations and disparities in healthcare, with 40% of patients at Boston Medical Center being Black, while only 5% of patients at Mass General. Very few Blacks in positions of power in Boston, although you did something about that, at least for the city. But the 10 largest law firms in Boston had over 1,000 partners in the aggregate, but only 8 of those partners were Black. And as you know, even beyond the Globe series from a few years ago, the list of current and documented and significant disparities between people of color and white people goes on and on and on, with incarceration rates, police brutality, exposure to pollutants, wage gaps, what you read about or heard about today on mortgage approvals. We still have a long way to go. And I'm curious, when you read a series like the Globe series, hear a report like you heard on the radio today, are you surprised? How does it make you feel? I know you've expressed a lot of optimism about where we can go, but how does...
It makes me angry, Jay. I'm not going to be optimistic on this one. You know, it makes me feel sad. It makes me feel angry. I'm frustrated, as many others are, because these issues aren't new. And so that's one issue. These are not new issues. The second thing is, for many of us, we are living that reality. We have expressed concern around that reality, and all of that has fallen on deaf ears. So it took, you know, a December 2017 series of the Boston Globe for people to start waking up. The $8 of wealth for Black households, that's a figure that was a report the Fed did in 2015. So 2 years had passed before that even got any legs. And it wasn't until 2017, when the Globe reported it, that people started to pay attention. The Seaport neighborhood that you mentioned, hardly any Black residents, any Black businesses, any Black developers. And it was created with a significant amount of public dollars, not just private dollars, public dollars.
When I was in state government, we contributed a bunch.
There it is. And so these aren't new issues, and it's important for us to understand that all of the inequities that we see throughout society, all of the issues that you mentioned, whether housing, education, healthcare, transportation, climate, you name it, all of them are rooted in policy. And there's a long history. You know, this whole thing was crafted by the first colonists who arrived. It was institutionalized by the founding fathers. And then it was perfected by generations of subsequent lawmakers who went out of their way, oftentimes, to create policies to benefit the few at the expense of everyone else. That is how we have gotten here. And so it has been 400 years of policies to elevate white men, and that's usually the case. And it is going to take more than one Black mayor. It is going to take more than one piece of legislation. It's going to take more than one anything to undo much of that destructive policies that have led us here. And so I am angry, but I remain hopeful and encouraged because I see a new generation of women of color running for office. I see not just people running for office, but people who are organizing, because it's not just an elected office. It's not just through city, state, or federal government that you can play a role to change conditions for people in our city, commonwealth, or country. It is through through nonprofits, through law firms, through corporations, through so many other ways that people can affect change and make change happen. So I'm encouraged that people are organizing, that people are running for office. And you're right, we've got tons of work to do.
Yeah, and as you said, it's all deeply rooted.
Deeply rooted.
And not easily unrooted.
No.
And it's complicated, and they're all these issues are interrelated and connected, and you, through your lived experience, obviously, well, let me take a step back. These are all a bunch of numbers on pieces of paper, but they're all reflecting people's life experience. There are people behind every single one of those stats, and it's impacting them in their day-to-day life in a very real way. And sometimes for those of us who don't experience those same things, it it doesn't come through the numbers and what's on the page, as not only through your lived experience, but as the mayor of Boston, as a city councilor, you had a really unique opportunity to see up close and personal how people were being affected by these disparities and inequities. And you made it your priority. The way you talked about your mayoralship was you were taking on issues of equity. That was what it was about.
Yeah.
Whether it was homelessness, police reform, transportation equity, development equity, dealing with COVID in an equitable way, which, bad luck during your term as mayor, you're on top of everything else, you've got that. But that was your priority. You were very clear about that. And you were successful in a lot of ways. There's still a lot to do. I'm wondering if, even though it's systemic, as you talked about, and it's complicated, and there's no one silver bullet, if there's anything in particular that you feel is more urgent, or any one of these disparities or inequities that Boston needs to have a bigger sense of urgency about, and maybe at a level that's above some of the others, that you think will help move us in the right direction faster?
Yeah, and I hate to kind of pick the one thing as if, again, one thing is going to solve it all. But I think we've got to focus on this racial wealth gap. We've got to focus on ensuring that, residents of our great city can experience our great city and all of the benefits of living in Boston, and to be able to pass on generational wealth. That $8 figure is still
mind-blowing.
It is. Yeah. It is. And I remember back in 2015, because I was when the Fed released that report, they hosted something at their office. I was there. I remember leaving and texting someone and saying it, and they just didn't believe, like, it was absurd. It was unbelievable because the number was so low. And I was like, no, that's what they said, $8. I took a picture of the screen, of the slide deck on the screen. I remember that. But again, 2 years would pass before people would kind of raise eyebrows and gasp. And now here we are 4 years later, and still I don't know that there is a thoughtful plan. I think homeownership has to be part of it. We can't talk about closing a wealth gap without talking about homeownership. So the story this morning about Black people and Latino people continuing to be denied loans at higher rates, and that communities of color have fewer loan applications or loan approvals, I should say, than other communities is very problematic. So I would suggest some focus on homeownership, focus on entrepreneurship, and focus on education. As
city's doing right now that you think are helping drive in that direction on these issues? Anything in particular that you did when you were there that you want to talk about, or anything more that you think the city needs to be doing to drive the wealth issue? Yeah,
well, I'm very proud of the work that I did as the mayor on housing issues. As I shared, growing up in the city of Boston, was housing insecure for a number of years, bounced around a lot when I lived with my mom. We lived in all kinds of different apartments. Sometimes we didn't have our own apartment and we had to stay with relatives. And there was a short period of time where I even stayed in a shelter as a kid. And then as a young adult, my very first apartment, I was able to get through a Section 8 voucher. And those lived experiences informed certainly my thinking around housing. My very first week as mayor of Boston invested $5 million in the rental relief fund to help families. 70% of those families helped are families of color. We also did $5 million in a foreclosure prevention fund to help those who already own their homes to stay in their homes. When the federal government was not able to keep the eviction moratorium in place, when it was struck down by the courts, I put one in place for Boston. That eventually got struck down, but it helped. It helped provide some relief. I'm very proud of the fact that for home ownership opportunities, we quadrupled the down payment assistance that the city offers to first-time home buyers. And so we took that amount from $10,000 to $40,000. So we did a lot of work on that front. The city continues to do work on this front. You've got to look at development as a whole as well. It can't just be a series of programs. But I would suggest that it's not just city government. Like when we're talking about addressing a wealth gap, you know, we need for private industry to be at the table as partners in this work. So it's not just about what city government can do or should be doing, you know, what are corporations doing in this space.
It's a great segue.
Okay.
Because we're going to talk about the business community right now. Excellent. And their role. So we were talking about it takes a lot of people. You also were expressing some frustration when we were talking about the laundry list of disparities and inequities that continue to exist, that it takes, this has been going on forever. And these disparities have existed forever. And it takes a Boston Globe series report or a George Floyd horrendous murder that galvanizes people or gets people focused who maybe otherwise aren't as focused on these issues in terms of ways in which they can help. And I think the business community, I think everybody would acknowledge and admit that the business community on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion has been more reactive historically than anything. Business community is very broad. There are lots of different participants in the business community in Boston, but let's just focus on the larger employers that are mostly downtown, corporations, law firms, others that have resources to do stuff. I think in the, everyone would kind of say in the wake in Boston became galvanized again. There was a more intense focus and activity among the business community to get engaged in ways that they could be helpful. I want to come back to specific initiatives that members of the business community are engaging in and just get a sense from you about, generally speaking, are you encouraged by the Boston business community, as I defined it, in terms of how they've been engaging over the last couple of years to help address the racial wealth gap, other disparities, and what do you generally see as the role of the Boston business community in helping to make progress on these issues?
Great question, and I'm gonna start with the horrendous murder of George Floyd. It is in some ways very sad that it took that to get people to kind of look at these issues in a different kind of light. I'm encouraged that people are wrestling with these issues, are trying to figure out what to do and want to do something. I'm worried about fatigue. I'm worried that people either think they've done enough, or that happened 2 years ago. Why are we still talking about that? I remember this conversation that I had with my predecessor, Mayor Walsh. I was the president of the council, and it was in the days after George Floyd was murdered. And I remember being so angry and so hurt and so frustrated. And I remember then Mayor Walsh saying to me that this time it was different. This time it was different. Things were different. You know, people's eyes were kind of opened up. And I remember going back to him and saying, no, this is not different. This has been happening over and over and over again. You know, we've seen so many people killed. And, you know, as I reflect on this conversation, my thinking is that we were both right. You know, this was different, and yet here we are again with the same thing. And so what I hope to see from the business community is the persistence to continue to think about how to do their work differently, and to have the political will and courage to be bold about it and to be unapologetic about it. I don't know if you're ready to get to your second part, but I'm ready to get in with some clear things. So if we're talking about homeownership, entrepreneurship, education, and what the business community can do, specifically for Black residents, for residents of color, but particularly Black residents and Latino residents, I want them to kind of stand in that and own that. I think oftentimes we worry about who's going to feel uncomfortable if we start talking about these issues, or if we acknowledge that the system isn't fair, that somehow, you know, we're talking bad about our country if we acknowledge these things. And we've got to be willing to look at the hard truth. And we've got to be willing to take on these challenges, and to do so with the courage that is needed to get us to the next step in this journey. This is ongoing work. So I don't want to give the impression that it is a one and done, a checklist, and we can then go about our business. This is going to involve constant review to see, are we having the intended outcomes that we're looking to have? And if not, what do we need to change and do different?
It's a really good point. I want to emphasize, though, Mayor Janey says, yes, the business community has a big role to play.
Yes.
Be bold. She wants us to be bold.
And unapologetic, like you've got to.
Well, and one of the other things you mentioned as a perspective to think about is the way in which we're helping residents of color in the community in which we're located.
Absolutely.
Which I just want to pause on that, because I think that's, I'm not sure every company thinks that way. You know, that we want to make sure that the people working here are diverse. We want to give opportunities to vendors who are diverse. You know, a lot of employers are, you know, many have more intense initiatives in place to improve diversity among leadership, their boards, contract with minority-owned local businesses. There was an initiative recently announced that a handful of big companies in Boston, just a couple weeks ago, this apprenticeship program, which is much more focused on what you were just suggesting. It is basically creating internships in their companies for people who live in Boston, people of color who live in Boston, to train them to get jobs in their companies, which is going that extra step, I think, to the point you're talking about, is how do we help the people of color in the community in which we're located? And, you know, there are other initiatives that the business community is undertaking. I'm curious whether you have a perspective about any initiative like that you think is particularly important for big businesses in Boston to be undertaking. And I know one thing isn't enough, but is there anything in particular where you think the business community can really move the dial?
Yeah, I think all of that is very important. You know, we think of, so Boston, being the great city that it is, you know, lots of corporations want to be in Boston. So we've seen over the last 10, 20 years, the number of big corporations that want to relocate to Boston. And one of the perks of that relocation are the jobs that they bring. But the question always is, jobs for whom?
Who's
Getting these jobs? And so are they employees who already work for your company, for example, who are just going to relocate? Are they people who you're going to tap our great institutions of higher ed like Harvard and get somebody, or are they the local kid who grew up right here in this city? And so all of that is important. I encourage all of that. But when I say go bold and have the political courage, I'm thinking of something bigger, something that has the potential to have even greater impact. All of those things I want to see happen that you mentioned. I want to see more of it. I want it to be done better. Great. But I'd like to see corporations talk about reparations, for example, and to lay out a plan of what that looks like, particularly around homeownership, education, and entrepreneurship. We're thinking about, since George Floyd died, corporate America has pledged $50 billion to Black communities, right? Yeah. Of that, only $5 billion are grants. So the vast majority of that money is somehow still going to benefit the institutions who are giving that money, because there'll be loans and interest or what have you. So I'd love to see more grants. Maybe it is putting Black kids through school. You know, student debt is killing folks. People are not able to buy a home. They're not able to start a family. They're not able to live the lives that they hope to live because they're saddled with debt. Help buy a home. Making sure that we're doing more to support the business, not just to who we, you know, our vendors, but how are we supporting other Black business? Yeah. So I'd love to see corporations take a bigger,
thinking about themselves as a corporate citizen.
Yes.
And it's not even just being a good corporate citizen and helping to be a part of the solution addressing these inequities. It's a business imperative now too. I know every time recently we have submitted an RFP response to get business from somebody who's looking to hire a law firm, they're asking us, what are we doing on this? And there should be a moral imperative on the part of companies, but also it's a business imperative now. People are not going to want to do business with an entity that isn't attuned to these issues and working to be part of the solution on them.
The other thing though, Jay, it's not just the moral or people don't want to do business if you're not, you know, making good decisions and fulfilling someone's sense of their values. It's also better for your business. So it's better for your bottom line. Yes. So it's not just, this is the right thing to do, we should do it because other people won't want to, you know, hire us if we don't do it. It's better for our bottom line if we do it. Yeah. And that's the thing that seems to continue to get lost in all of this. And there's study after study after study that supports that it's better for your bottom line. And yet we still see businesses that continue, and maybe it's not out of being malicious, maybe it's out of that habit of this is how we've always done things. Right. And so how we cut through that, the culture of this is how we've always done it. So for example, hiring. People hire, they think about their networks. If you're a white man, your network is more likely to be other white men. And so you then replicate yourself. And so how do you bring other folks in when you're talking about hiring so that you are going to have a candidate pool that is much more diverse. And if you do, it's going to be better for your bottom line. It's not just about a moral.
It's a really good point. And you're right, it is about habits. And people are comfortable with the people who they know and come from the same culture and come from the same background. And that is, a lot of that is subconscious.
Yep.
And so getting the diversity of perspective experience is going to make any institution stronger, better. There's all this stuff that's happening, and businesses are doing a lot. When we talked at a prior time in preparation for this event, you made the point that, well, yeah, it's great to do all these things, but is it working? Are businesses actually measuring if they're putting a new hiring process in place to break some of these habits and try to diversify their leadership and workforce? Are they really diversifying their leadership and workforce?
Right.
And, you know, that's a really fair question. And I think something that we in the business community should be holding ourselves accountable to, not just, hey, we're able to say we're doing a bunch of stuff, but we're actually getting things done and making progress. But
exactly.
I'm curious if you could just say a little bit.
No, but that's exactly the point that I was making. And it's great. You mentioned a list of different initiatives that many businesses are taking. Those are all great things. Like, I encourage that. But without the measures, without making sure that we are stopping to evaluate and assess whether or not we've made progress, whether or not we are achieving the intended outcome of diversifying our workforce or our board or leadership within an organization. How are we measuring that? And then when we see that perhaps we're not where we need to be, what are we doing different? How are we tweaking that so that we can, in fact, make sure that we're putting the best strategies out there to have the best results?
Yeah, and lots of other ways businesses do that, right? That's a business mindset. We got to measure what we're doing to make sure we're making progress. This is another area. I'm looking over here because Lee, thank you very much, is handing me questions that folks who are watching have submitted. So I'm just going to read you some, if that's all right. It is unclear who this question is from, but they were respectful and started it with Mayor Janey. What to date was your highest moment and also your lowest moment?
Oh, wow. You know, I'm still very much in reflective mode. I'm not sure that I've sorted all of that out just yet. There are a number of high moments. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, being able to help people is certainly a high moment. I think one of the, well, a couple of low moments, losing the prelim was certainly a low moment.
I can relate to that.
Yes, so there you go. If you lose your prelim, you're not able to stick around for the general.
Yeah.
So that was certainly a low moment, but I'm still very much in a reflective season of my life and trying to piece all of that together. But thank you for that question.
Great. And this one is from Jim Moore. Mayor Janey, my company provides digital and health equity assessments for municipal and county governments. Can you repeat what you were doing with Harvard? A poor internet connection caused me to miss it.
Okay. You know, on a serious note, the digital divide is another big issue around DEI that we all need to concern ourselves with. And if we didn't understand that before the pandemic certainly has shown us through remote work and remote learning with our children how much we rely on good, solid internet and devices. So I'm just going to bring that up because we're talking about DEI. But I was saying how much I enjoyed my fellowships, both at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, as well as at Salem State University. I am doing 2 fellowships working with those universities, working with students, and it has been incredible.
Great. And Jim, thanks for what you're doing. Sounds really important. Third question, Mayor Janey. Do you feel as if the younger generations are more open-minded about different cultures compared to the older generations? Do you ever get a sense from the different communities that change is occurring?
You know, yes, I tend to think with each generation, we're getting better. I believe that we are getting better.
There's that optimism.
There is. It's that optimism. I'm thinking of my students. I'm thinking of my students at Harvard and at Salem State, and they are so smart. They're wrestling with these issues that we're discussing now. They are thinking of solutions and how they might contribute. Already, some of them are still teenagers. It is. So I stay encouraged by that. But there is still so much work, and it really will take all of us. So I think the approach has to be intergenerational, with all of us working together toward shared goals. Yeah, it is interesting. I share the assessment about the younger generation too, and my daughters have just grown up in a totally different world. Yeah. In terms of the extent to which they've been exposed to different people who are different from them, and what's okay and what's not okay is I think there has been progress in some of those ways that they're learning in a different way. My grandsons, who are now 14 and 18, the first half of their lives was President Barack Obama. Yeah. That's all they knew until they became teenagers and Trump came, which was really scary for us. My granddaughter, who is 7, all she has known has been, I ran for office for the first time, I think she was 2-3 years old. So this is all she's ever known. And for her, she's had a Black mayor. She's got another woman mayor who's a person of color. Yeah. She's surrounded by women of color who are doing amazing things, which is incredible. It makes a huge difference. It does in terms of the freedom that it provides for a child to dream big without limitation. Too often, children, if they can't see it, they can never dream of being it. And so, I'm so fortunate that not just my grandchildren, but this new generation of children, particularly here in the city of Boston, get to see their elected leaders, the strong women and people of color representing them, which is really exciting, particularly for Boston. And you're a part of that, which is cool. Because you said it, I have to skip to this question because I saw these words. If it's true that you can't be what you can't see, which you literally just said, what did you see in your life? What did you see in your life that made you think you could lead the city? And is there a role for white people in the Boston business community to help nurture the aspirations of Black children and teens? What a great question. Great question. And I'll start with the second part of that question. These issues that we're talking about, diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice, it really requires that all of us do our part. And so, earlier I had mentioned it's not just city government, it's the business community, but it's not just the business community, it's everyone needing to do their part to whatever that is. And that's going to look different for different people. So I'm not going to run through a list of suggestions, but yes. The first part of the question, I never thought about being mayor of Boston. I didn't see that growing up. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a nurse. I used to watch a television show called Julia with Diane Carroll. It was the first television show to feature a Black woman as the lead actress. And it would be 30 years before we would have that again. Wow. Let's hope it's not 30 years before we get another Black woman mayor. But the role model, seeing a woman in a profession impacted what you thought about your own career And so I never thought about elected office. Other people saw that for me. Long before I ran for office, I had people who would always say,
what was it about you?
I don't know. I don't know. Other than I've always been passionate and about the issues that I care about, and willing to try to do something about it. So maybe people saw something in me with those two traits that suggested I should run for office. But it took forever for me to actually do it. Like really? 2017, when I did it, was probably after 20 years of people saying, 15, 20 years of people saying.
What finally flipped that switch?
What it was just this feeling of being at a crossroads, this feeling of, for too long, seeing so many people like me, who look like me, people from my community who are being left out of the prosperity in Boston, left out of the opportunity. I saw all these cranes in the sky, and if we look at unemployment, whatever metric we look at, Black people in Boston were always at the bottom. We're looking at who's working on these jobs. So we're looking at development, who's working on these jobs. Looking at healthcare, there's a 30-year life expectancy gap from Symphony Hall to Grove Hall, which was in my city council district. So there were so many challenges that I just felt like if I took the advocacy and the organizing that I had been doing and the policy work that I had been doing in the nonprofit space and applied that to city government through a run in city council, maybe I could have a greater impact.
You wanted to make a difference.
I did. Well, and I was making a difference though. So I want to be clear that people can make a difference. It's not just in elected office, and you know this.
Yeah.
It's not just an elected office. So I had already had a career in advocacy and the nonprofit leadership and had been making a difference in that space, but that I could make a greater impact and impact more people by running for office. So that's why I did.
So all of those people for 20 years who've been encouraging you to run and thought you'd be good were absolutely right.
Thank you.
And I want to brag for you a little bit. I don't remember exactly how many people, but it felt like there were like 15 people running for city council the first year you ran.
It was 13.
13 people.
It was 13.
So it was almost the entire city.
The entire, so there's 13 people on the city council, just to put some perspective on that.
Yeah.
There's 13 city councilors on the Boston City Council, and there were 13 candidates running for this one district council seat.
I remember when I was campaigning at that time, and I'd go to an event in your district. It would be a very long event because they had to negotiate giving every single one of your competitor candidates an opportunity to speak, which took a long time. But anyway, it's very impressive that you ended up winning that race, your first try. And you clearly have a lot of gifts as a public official that kept you going and doing a lot of great things and making the impact. But it leads to this next question. I was wondering how long it was going to take before we got to it. Someone wants to know if you have plans to run for an elected office in the future.
Well, I will never rule it out. So I hope everyone is watching. Just stay tuned. Be on the lookout for the memoir.
That sounds
Pay attention to any social media posts with amazing videos.
I don't know. That sounds like
launching campaigns.
That sounds like
I don't know. To be serious, I don't know if I'll run for office again, but I won't. At this point, I can't say a definitive yes or no. So I'm open. I'm open. For me, what has always been important is the work. Where can I make a difference? How can I help people? Whatever the title, I'm happy to do that. So we'll see what the future holds.
I'm glad you continue to be open to it.
Okay.
It is a big commitment, though.
It is.
Right? And there are other ways that you can serve, but if the right opportunity comes up, we'd be. I think I speak for a lot of people. We'd be glad to see you take it. Another question we have: who are your political heroes in Massachusetts and nationally, and why?
Oh, wow. I'm going to start nationally and talk about Ketanji Brown Jackson and the grace and the poise that she has demonstrated throughout her confirmation hearings, and just the perspective that she brings, not only as a Black woman, but as a public defender. And, you know, I'm just in awe. I am very proud, and certainly hope to see her confirmed soon. Locally, and there are many more nationally. Marion Wright Edelman, the Children's Defense Fund, of people who have already passed, people like Ella Jo Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer have been big, important role models, heroes for me. Locally, certainly Representative Presley. We served together on the Boston City Council. For folks who may not know, she was the first Black woman elected to the Boston City Council. That was 2009. And I point out the year because I think it's important for people to understand it's only been a short period of time.
Not long ago it was.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before then, we did not have Black people,
Yeah.
Black women on the city council, and that this burst, if you will, of women of color running for office is a recent phenomenon in the numbers that we're seeing now. Now, there are Black women who ran for office. Shirley Chisholm was a congresswoman and ran for president. So we have seen Black women run for office and she's also another hero. So I'll mention her. So, but I would say Ayanna Pressley, I would say Rachel Rollins, our senior senator, Elizabeth Warren, I would put on that list. Was the question just about women, or am I just focused on women? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't. Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. But we have a lot of powerhouse women, public officials in Massachusetts, all of whom you mentioned are inspiring.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, wow. This is a great question. And it's one that I try to reflect on every so often. And one day, hopefully, I'll write a letter to my younger self. And really, and put it out there, because it is a great question. I think I would say two things. One, the importance of believing in yourself and the importance of loving yourself. I think women in general, and Black women in particular, the world has shown over and over and over again their disdain for Black women, and much of that can be internalized. And so the need to elevate Black women and little Black girls is very, very important to me. In fact, whenever I see little girls, period, but especially little girls of color, I try to affirm something about them always, because the world tells women and girls all the time that we're not worthy. We're not pretty enough, we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not whatever it is. And there's a whole industry in terms of people who are making money on those insecurities all the time. Buy this product so you can be thinner, buy this product so your hair can do this, put on this makeup so you can look like this, get this surgery so you'll be more desired. Whatever the issue is, women are constantly told that they're not good enough as they are. And this is even more true for women of color, especially Black women. And so I would emphasize the importance of believing in yourself and loving yourself.
That's great. And all those issues compounded by social media, as I see with my daughters.
Yes, it really is. Yeah. It's a whole new world with social media. And in fact, it's interesting how that also shapes the conversations that we're having now, how it shapes politics in terms of running for office, like it is, and conversations that kids are having with each other, the bullying and the need to have these perfect images. I mean, if we thought a Barbie doll was harmful, imagine, what that looks like. Nothing against Barbie dolls. I'm talking about the perfection or the standard that you cannot even live up to because her body proportions are off.
Not real.
They're not real. But we're all made to believe that we should aspire and strive for these impossible standards. So it's a good example because it's an impossible standard. And so, yeah. So all the best to your daughters.
Thanks.
They've got to deal with social media.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Everything else. It really isn't.
All right, we'll see if you've got a view on this one. Where is the biggest area of need in the city of Boston for pro bono representation? How can lawyers play an active role in dismantling some of the systems of inequity that you discussed?
Oh, wonderful. So probably lots of areas. Off the top of my head, I would say pro bono work in helping entrepreneurs of color establish cannabis businesses. While I was on the city council, I authored and got passed groundbreaking legislation.
Okay.
And so many still need support. For all of the reasons that we already know in terms of society being unequal and unjust. And so it's not enough to pass legislation that gives you an opportunity if you don't have the other things that you need to put in place to take advantage of that opportunity. So that's one example. I think some pro bono work on helping entrepreneurs of color start their business, and particularly in the cannabis space, because there's a real opportunity to kind of dismantle, generational poverty and start building wealth.
Great.
With that industry.
Well, and I'll say to the person who asked this question, and to you, we actually have a lot of expertise in the cannabis area.
Excellent.
We do some work in that area. And we are, as a firm, in conversations about ways in which we can provide pro bono legal services to small businesses owned by people of color. And we're close to having a really important partnership where we're going to be engaged in that way, which personally I'm really excited about.
Excellent.
All right, somebody says, what a great conversation. Mayor Janey mentioned education as another priority. At the same time, it seems like every mayor in my time in Boston has spoken of the need to improve the schools. Why is this so hard? And why do we keep turning over school leadership? It seems really hard to make long-term change with short-term leadership. I guess that's
True.
a question.
Every mayor has talked about the importance of education because education has the power to change not just lives, but communities. And, I think not enough of us think about our public schools as being our public schools. We too often are thinking about our individual needs with our own families. And I am not faulting any parent for prioritizing their children. You should absolutely do that. And every parent wants their child to get the best education. I applaud that. I support that. But what I'm really pointing out is that our public schools are everyone's business. Regardless of whether you are a parent, whether your children are already grown and graduated, whether you utilize our public schools are everyone's business. It is our future workforce. And if our school children are not being supported, if our schools are failing them, that is our failure as a society, as a system. And we are all going to pay the price for that. We will pay the price for that with crime. We will pay the price for that and not having a workforce. We will pay the price in that and having concentration of poverty continue. We will pay the price. And so I think it's important to invest now. And it's not just dollars, it's not just money. It is in good people, to your point. around district leadership. We need to invest. There are a whole range of like issues that I could go through, which I don't think we have time for. Everything from teacher diversity, from looking at external partners and how that is coordinated and how we use an equity lens to determine the partnerships, looking at expansion of dual language opportunities, examining what is happening for students with disabilities, particularly Black and Latino boys, who has access to gifted and talented programs like our exam schools. I mean, so many issues I could take you down the list. I think since we're talking about DEI, really important, as I mentioned earlier, to decolonize our schools. And that I think is a term, a scary term. Well, so there is a debate ranging all across our country around CRT, right? Whatever that means, critical race theory. I believe there is truth, and then there is portions of truth, and then there's full truth. And so what are we gonna tell a full story, or are we gonna tell a sliver of that? And so I don't see this as a theory. I see this as us telling the full story. What I mean by decolonizing is, for probably everyone on this call, we've all gone through a school system that has centered and prioritized Western civilization at the expense of everything else. And so to decolonize means to decenter and not just talk about the Dutch and the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish and how they conquered the Americas, but really talking about the contributions of all peoples throughout the world, but particularly those in the Americas who weren't the conquerors, those who were conquered, and the contributions that they have made to society back then and continue to make now, and that struggle for liberation and all of that. There is a quote that I love, and it was featured in an article that I read about decolonizing our schools. It said we don't need a diverse curriculum, we need a decolonized curriculum. And the distinction was, we can continue to add more ethnic studies, but if we continue to do that in a way that is still centering a European experience over all others, then we're just kind of adding things around the edges. We're not really dealing with it. The quote that was in this article said, until the tale of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale will always glorify the hunter, or something like that. And that's what our schools continue to do. And that's what much of society continues to do.
Yeah.
So,
well, hearing you talk about the importance of our schools and how they're ours, and we all have a responsibility, I couldn't agree more with. There are lots of issues and it's complicated, and I know you didn't have time to talk through all of them, but we need people in public office and in the rest of the community who are going to care about the success of our schools. This is probably our last question, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. A remarkable conversation. Thank you. Thanks to the interviewer for asking insightful questions. You're welcome. Clearly a person of excellent judgment wrote this.
Did you write this question, Jack?
Had it planted. And many thanks to Mayor Janey for being so candid. You are a thoughtful, inspiring, and a generational leader. My question is, are we better off as a society to not call attention to a person's race while doing all we can to make a more inclusive and equitable society? For example, when I watched the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation hearings, I was struck by how much the media and commentators focused on her race. When we do this, are we inadvertently magnifying our differences? Thanks much.
That's a great question. you know, for me, I think it's important to acknowledge race. And it's okay to acknowledge difference. I think it's okay. You know, when people say to me, and people have said this, oh, I don't see color. What they mean by that, I know what they mean. They want to suggest that you're just a person and I appreciate you being a person and I like you because you're a good person. So I appreciate the sentiment, but it erases me. Like, of course because one, it's not true. Of course you see, so first of all, we live in America and race, whether we believe it's real or not real, social construct or not, this is the framework in which we are all operating. And so I want to be seen. I want to be seen. I want to be seen for more than just being a woman or being Black, but I do want that part of me to also be seen. And in this particular example, I think perhaps why it was emphasized so much is because of the historic nature of her nomination. This is the first time ever that a Black woman has been nominated. And this is a beautiful Black woman with dark brown skin, and her hair has sister locks. And that is so powerful for my granddaughter, for your daughters, for everyone's daughters and everyone's sons to see. It is important not just for little girls to see, but for boys to see, you know, that our Supreme Court will finally now have a Black woman. Now, we've got more work to do on the Supreme Court. We've got more work to do on the Boston City Council, but those small victories are important victories. And so I personally am not bothered or offended. In fact, I celebrate the fact that she is a Black woman, and that that her qualifications have got her this far. And so I'm happy to acknowledge her full self. When I see her, you know, in the confirmation hearings, and I'm happy to see her full self, and I want people to see my full self. But I think I do understand why that question was asked. It's I think in part hopes that we can get to a post-racial society. Maybe that's not what you're hoping for, I don't know. But I don't know that we can. What I hope for is that we can get to a place where we appreciate the difference that we may have, the difference in terms of race, in terms of language, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of nationality, in terms of gender, in terms of identity. And it's okay that we recognize and celebrate those differences and see them as strengths rather than as things that divide us. I think sometimes the way the media talks about race or the way politicians talk about race can feel really divisive. There's nothing wrong with people being of different backgrounds, different religions, different experiences, as long as we can appreciate those differences.
Appreciate, celebrate.
That's it.
See that they make us stronger. And What a great answer to end on. I personally just want to say I'm so appreciative that you came. I loved you as an elected official. I love you as a person. You clearly are extremely thoughtful, caring, big heart, and we were lucky to have you in that position. Hinckley Allen's lucky to have you here talking with us today. So thank you for
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope this has been helpful. I am certainly encouraged by the work that you are undertaking and hope that you will continue. We'll stay in touch. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And before we take off, we're going to hear one closing word from the chairman of our DEI committee, Noble Allen.
Good. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Noble.
All right. Thank you so much, Mayor. On behalf of the D&I committee and on behalf of Hinckley, the entire firm, I really want to express a deepest gratitude to you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your invaluable perspective and life experiences regarding these important topics. I would also like to thank my good friend Jay Gonzalez and fellow D&I committee member for skillfully navigating this great conversation with the mayor. As David Rubin said, this is the first of many lunch and learns that the D&I committee intends to launch with both the D&I committee and also the task force, which is comprised exclusively of non-lawyers. So we hope to continue to bring you events such as this, and we hope that these conversations will help all of us understand and appreciate the important issues of racial equality, racial justice in our local communities and also in our business communities. So again, Mayor, we please accept our deepest gratitude for your insightful thoughts and observation this afternoon.
Thanks, Noble. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for attending.